Hey class, welcome to week 8. This week we're going to cover the effects from last lecture where 1800 rolls by, John Adams is defeated for the presidency, and the Federalists are driven from power and in place. Jefferson and his Republicans become the dominant faction of the United States. So we're going to look at this and see how, one, Jefferson's Republicans wipe out the Federalists as a political rival, and the United States for about 20-ish years becomes something like a one-party state. And we'll see how that develops. Secondly, we're going to see how the United States as a nation, some of the social, cultural effects, how it develops. Mainly this lecture is going to focus on the politics. If you want more about some of the cultural effects going on, consult the textbook, or it's also good if you don't know what a term is, you should go through, look it up. Wikipedia is useful as sort of a baseline to kind of understand what's going on. But nevertheless, this lecture we're going to cover some of these social changes, what's going on among different Native Americans, how are they responding to this, what's going on among right, we haven't really talked too much about the opinions and perspectives of the black population, right, both free and slave. So we're going to kind of dig into that a little bit, and especially looking at it from the vantage of the powerful, of the governing, and see how they're perceiving it, right? And while it's important, you want to understand the opinions and perspectives of all the little people, right? It's very key to understand that in any kind of historical situation. You best not pretend that they're not the ones who are struggling under, this or that government. So it's best to understand what kind of governments we're dealing with, what kind of social majorities, what kind of powers that exist, right? I think that's really more important to kind of grasp within history so that you can understand, structural dynamics, how things change, how powerful forces, whether governments or states or cultural entities, religious bodies, etc., how those influence debates, how people talk about things, how people think about things, and sort of what possible options are on the table, right? And when you buck those things, when you fight against them, there are certain challenges and limitations that people face. So it's best to understand how those dynamics work. Mainly, I mean, you can take this in a historical sense where you're trying to understand the past, how people thought, why people thought the way that they did, the actions that seemed reasonable to them. But then you can also take that perspective in your own life today and try to understand yourself critically, right? Kind of have a meta view of yourself and your time, not so that you can escape it, but that you can better understand the moment in which you live and why certain things seem reasonable, why certain ideas seem like that's the best or only way. And it helps give you a sense of yourself so that you can start to think outside the box, right? You have to know you're in the box to start thinking outside the box. Anyway, that's just some preliminary stuff. So let's get on with the lecture. So where we left off, Jefferson wins in 1800. He'll go on to win a second term, and right following Washington's example, he'll never take more than 2 terms, and he'll be succeeded by his right-hand man, James Madison. James Madison will select one of Jefferson's sort of younger disciples to be his right-hand man, who is also a Virginian named James Monroe. And through the three of them, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, you'll have about 12 years of single-party rule. Right, the Federalists are wiped out, and the United States basically operates as a one-party state, which might not be so bad. Right, there are positives and negatives to this sort of thing. You don't always need a kind of external opposition, but in this case, right, the Republican Party or the Democratic Republican Party, it's, right, it's grassroots. It's not functioning like a machine party like the ones we have today. It's a lot more disorganized and fractured between different states and different constituencies. But through the three of them, Republicans have 12 years of pretty consistent dominance. Now, wasn't always clear that the Federalists were gone. As we'll see, there are some cases where they seem to make a comeback. But that's just sort of, so the end of the picture, at least for the era we're looking at, right? This is what makes it sort of a Jeffersonian revolution, right? It's a party government, right? The idea that parties shouldn't exist is rapidly falling out of sight. The idea that, like a George Washington president who's not clearly associated with a group against another group, that still continues in form, but it's very clear Jefferson is a party man, and so are his successors. So the idea of electing people based on political party rather than, their personal attributes, undetached, totally detached from, um, any specific platform or any specific organization, right? That's going by the wayside. Now, a main element to Jefferson's one-party victory, the victory of the Republicans, which for Americans, right, like I was trying to explain in the last lecture, this was an argument about the future of the common man within the American Republic, right? Should the United States be run by a few, particularly wealthy elite, or should it be opened up increasingly for more and more people? So the victory of Jefferson and the victory of the Republicans was essentially a victory for the common man, right? Right or wrong, right? You might say the common man is an idiot. He doesn't really know what's good for the country. You'll have people, right? The development of democracy in the United States, and we'll see this with Jackson, comes concurrently with the development of white supremacy. The idea that common white men, particularly, have a lot more in common as regular people, and they should have access, but that comes at the expense of especially other non-white peoples, which are, and it's distinguished in these kind of binary terms, right? You're either white or you're not white, and being not white tended to mean either you're an Indian, though there are some people who are mixed about whether Indians could eventually integrate. We already mentioned Jefferson thought that this was possible, but also obviously the other major figure or group would be if you're black, right? And black is defined in this very strict way. It's the one drop rule. It becomes incredibly essentialized, right? It becomes almost biological. And remember, race is a developing concept. It didn't happen that white people and black people saw each other this way. A few lectures ago in Pennsylvania, we were talking about how this had to develop as a reaction to sort of political issues on the ground, access to resources, and so it was a way of mobilizing people. And you could use it either way. In the issue that in the case of the Paxton Boys, right, white supremacy was used to motivate people to fight the Indians, and we didn't really get to look at this text, but Benjamin Franklin will reverse it and use an idea of white identity to criticize the Paxton Boys and actually defend the Indians as more truly white than the Scots-Irish who were massacring them. So it's a complicated concept. It's rhetorical. It has power in whoever can use it. So race is something that's not fixed, right? Whiteness will develop, blackness will develop. Not everybody thinks in these terms. Even the people who deploy this rhetoric don't necessarily think in these terms. So it's something that sort of is on the way. But as we'll see during this period, the idea of whiteness, the idea that being an American is linked explicitly to being a white man, particularly. But that will develop. But then the same tools that will emerge from Jefferson and Jackson will provide people with a voice to criticize that interpretation and to open up a kind of more popular view to more and more people, right? So women's activists will use the rhetoric of Jefferson and eventually Jackson. We'll get to Jackson next week, where you'll watch a documentary instead of a lecture. But this Jefferson, right? It's easy to condemn Jefferson, and people still do it today. Oh, he was just racist, right? Well, that's true, right? A lot of people, most people, almost everyone in this day, were starting to think in highly racialized terms. Even the people who wanted to end slavery, which Jefferson was paradoxically one of them, they thought in these terms too. Right? Jefferson didn't like slavery, but part of the reason he didn't want to end it right away, and we'll get into the terms of how he tried to curb it as a phenomenon in American society. But even though he didn't like it, he didn't think whites and blacks could integrate. He thought they were diametrically opposed. They were two radically different peoples, and their history of violent subordination of one group enslaving another made integration basically impossible. So Jefferson's sort of on the fence. He's not even quite sure if blacks have the same capacities as whites. He's On the one hand, he'll praise a female black poet named Phyllis Wheatley, um, but on the other hand, he's sort of on the fence about the mathematical capabilities of Benjamin Banneker, right? He'll think that Benjamin Banneker, who was a freed black mathematician who helped design Washington, D.C., he'll think Banneker maybe isn't actually a black man, that maybe a white man pretends to be a black man. You know, he'll voice this kind of skepticism. So, you know, even Jefferson is a highly complicated figure when it comes to race, and he reflects the highly complex nature of how race was used, and how every good in society may have dark elements, and the dark elements, even within the good, might be turned against it and be used for different purposes, right? So, we'll see Frederick Douglass will draw on the Jeffersonian heritage, the idea of economic democracy where somebody should have the right to own themselves and to own their own work and to have a kind of slice of the country that belongs to them. Frederick Douglass will use this to defend the rights of freed black men, right? And also use it as a hammer to destroy, at least ideologically, the institution of slavery. So we're going to get into more of this stuff as the class progresses, but that's just to give you a forecast of what's gonna happen, right? So anyway, back to the main points of the lecture. So Jefferson wins 1800. Part of the reason he's able to secure this one-party rule is the main engine of the Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton. He dies in 1804. Now, if you've seen the musical, you'll be aware that you know the basic dynamics of this story. Hamilton gets into a fight with Aaron Burr. Burr and Hamilton are both New Yorkers. They both hate each other. They're both connected roughly to the same world of bankers and financiers and lawyers and politicians. Burr is very shady. Hamilton is very shady. Burr impugns Hamilton's honor, and as both you know, Republican men who understand that you live and breathe and die by honor, right? You cannot allow someone to insult you with impunity, right? You have to take revenge. So Hamilton and Burr challenge each other to a duel, which means two guys go out, usually early in the morning, and all of this was illegal, but people still did this. You go out, you have a guy who carries your gun, you walk 10 paces from each other, and then you shoot at each other, and you take turns. And there's usually a coin flip or a gentleman's agreement on who gets to shoot first. Now, many times these duels were formalities, right? You didn't actually want to kill your opponent. You just wanted to prove a point that you weren't going to take crap from the other person, right? That your honor was defended and is valuable. You're not a loser. You actually stand up for yourself. Now, no one knows quite sure what happened, but Burr hit Hamilton in the heart, whether on purpose or accidentally, right? These guns were totally unwieldy. But Burr shoots Hamilton. Hamilton gets mortally wounded and dies soon afterwards, right? Now, of course, at this time, right, this is the great crazy part of this, Burr is the vice president of the United States. So now Burr is wanted for murder in the state of New Jersey, so he flees. Now, there isn't a federal police force, so when he goes back to Washington, D.C., even though he's wanted for murder in New Jersey, it's okay. No one's there to arrest him. Eventually, this kind of gets out of hand. Burr runs away out west, and there's a whole complicated and interesting story of intrigue where Burr may have been trying to build an army and kind of create a rival kingdom in the territory that Jefferson or the United States had not yet acquired. Another main factor of how Jeffersonians maintain power is a term called gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering, which is named after a guy named Elbridge Gerry, it's also pronounced gerrymandering, is the federal government's ability to determine government districting, right? So when you have votes for Congress, you belong to a congressional district, and the federal government determines the boundaries of each of those congressional districts. Now, of course, these districts need to be constantly updated because for House of Representative districts, they're only supposed to include roughly 10,000 people, right? And this gets updated at a later time. But right, as populations expand, you need to redistrict to create new districts so that state can have you know, the rightful proportionate voice. Now, of course, how do you district? The idea of gerrymandering is that you create districts that defend your party's majority, right? So say, you have roughly about, maybe there's 60% Democrat or 60% Federalists in a jurisdiction, 40% Republicans. Maybe you'll redistrict it so that you'll get two districts that roughly have slightly more Republicans, so that you'll get two votes, you'll get two representatives rather than getting stuck with one who's opposed to you, right? So gerrymandering is a kind of, it still goes on today about how you chop up districts. You might try to chop them up so that you get, you quarantine one group, so all of your enemies are stuck in one district, so they only get one representative, or the rest of the state is redistricted so that the other party is much more powerful. There's only so much you can do, and this is somewhat corrupt, but it's a way of kind of political management. And Jefferson's men, Elbridge Gerry's from Massachusetts, Jefferson didn't necessarily agree with this practice, but Republicans did it nevertheless. Another element that's ongoing, even though it's a one-party state, there are multiple factions. So as we'll see during Jefferson's presidency, he'll do things that seem un-Republican, right? And he will kind of create a faction within the Republican Party. It won't be Federalist, and they'll still associate with the Republicans, but they'll call themselves the Old Republicans, or sometimes they're known as the Tertium Quid. And these are people who are purists, right? They want to stay true to the values of Jefferson, even if Jefferson is not following through with them himself. There's a guy named John of Roanoke, who's a Virginian, who's one of the more famous members of the Tertium Quid. And, they just provide a kind of thorn in the side of Jefferson as he's trying to kind of conduct his presidency. So what does Jefferson do? Why did the Tertium Quid even arise in the first place? Well, Jefferson conducts these two things we're going to look at as a huge component of his presidency. This is what he's mainly remembered for. But this doesn't seem like the Jefferson that maybe you're familiar with, right? Small government, reducing the federal government, empowering the states. Right? How are these going to fit with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions? How are we going to fit with this idea of strict constitutionalism, right? Anything that is not in the Constitution, you can't use vague words to sort of bend powers into the federal government's possession. No, you got to be strict. Whatever it says, that's what the federal government can do, and whatever the Constitution does not say, the federal government cannot do, right? And Hamilton was infamous for taking very vague clauses within the Constitution and stuffing them full of powers, right? There's nothing in the Constitution about the United States contracting a national debt. There's nothing in the Constitution of about managing that debt by privileging a bank that was created by a kind of congressional fiat. There's limits on what do you think the government can do in terms of taxes. But nevertheless, Hamilton bends that. Jefferson opposes that. But in Jefferson's administration, he uses the federal government quite strongly. The main one, which many of you may be familiar with, is the Louisiana Purchase. In short, the Louisiana Purchase is the fact that Jefferson opens up a back channel with Napoleon. Napoleon, right, he's at war with Great Britain. He's at war with Europe, right? He's continuing the French Revolution by other means. He's basically become the government at this point, right? He's not crowned the emperor yet. That's not for another year, but he's basically dictator for life. It's called the consulship. Anyway, don't need to know anything about that. Napoleon needs cash. This is like some kind of liquidation scheme. He needs to trade in his annuity for cash right now, right? So he wants to trade in all this French territory, which was all Louisiana. It kind of flipped back and forth between Spain and France, but Napoleon wants to liquidate that instantly. He doesn't think the French are ever going to do anything. The French are never going to need it, right? The most important part of it was New Orleans, but that's not really useful at this time, and Napoleon's focused on Europe. So he opens his back channel, and he's willing to sell Jefferson this huge amount of land, and I'll show you the scope of it, for basically pennies on the dollar, right? So Jefferson has a quandary, right? On the one hand, normally, the federal government, if it's going to acquire this land, and it's legally allowed to, it has to pass through Congress, right? You can't sign a private deal and dump money from the Treasury into this without consulting Congress. However, on the other hand, this deal could evaporate at any moment, right? Napoleon could fall from power. Napoleon could change his mind. Who knows what would happen? So Jefferson makes a decision, right? A pragmatic one, perhaps. He decides to go ahead with the deal, authorizes the exchange of money from the Treasury to Napoleon, and overnight the United States doubles in size. Now, of course, the tertium quid go nuts, right? The old Republicans, they say, this is an outrage. You're not allowed to do this, President Jefferson. On the other hand, the Federalists are laughing. They're like, see, you're a hypocrite, right? We always knew that you would cave, right? We always knew that this form of government that we've been pursuing is the only reasonable, rational way to do things. And so Jefferson, you're a fool. Now, and we'll get to this when we look at the Barbary Wars. Now the question is, right, is this actually hypocrisy, or is this actually fulfilling Jefferson's vision? And I would argue it's the latter. Right? Jefferson believed in economic democracy. He believed in the ability for every American citizen, which meant mainly white men. Right? There were very few freed blacks, and as these Jeffersonian reforms come in, the states tend to strip the rights of the freed blacks who do exist. But that's not exactly something Jefferson pioneered. Nevertheless, right, as the country develops, as the population grows, you're going to need more land, right? Because each person, each family is going to need their own kind of home, right? This is the idea that each person owns their own means of production. It means they can kind of produce their own livelihood. They don't depend upon an employer. They're not a servant for someone. And again, as I mentioned last lecture, there's a great irony that even as this system is being promoted, it's being promoted while slavery exists. So how is it about the rights of each man if each man is owning other men, right? How is this actually free? And this contradiction will come up later, right? This will ultimately be the basis of the Civil War. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that the Civil War is caused by slavery, but we don't get there yet. Anyway, I see the Louisiana Purchase is fulfilling Jefferson's vision. Right? That's the point of the government. The point of the government is to get access so that every person has their own means of sustenance, right? So that no people are allowed to sort of fall into a kind of bondage, whether it's by wages or by servanthood or literally slavery. Or Jefferson is opposed to this. So in a way, the Louisiana Purchase, even though it violates his ideas about consulting Congress, being a strict constitutionalist, the reason he was a strict constitutionalist was to defend the rights of the average common man. So in a lot of ways, the Louisiana Purchase is fulfilling that. And in this case, it fulfills it by increasing the power of the presidency. And we'll see this in Jackson's case too, about how the presidency is used as a popular instrument to sort of push back against elite interest in other branches of government. And this will make things very complicated. But that's not till the next lecture. The other major thing is that, all right, John Adams helped create the Navy, right? He creates a Department of Navy so that now the United States has ships to protect itself. So Jefferson inherits this, and he's confronted with a problem. There's a group of pirates that live on the coast of North Africa, and for over a century they had been kidnapping European sailors, selling them into slavery, and most importantly, using their piracy and their slaving as a threat to blackmail the kingdoms of Europe. So most kingdoms of Europe, they were engaged with too many other problems. The Barbary pirates were not strong enough to really merit a full-scale invasion. So governments of Europe basically paid them blackmail, right? We'll give you a sack of money. Please stop kidnapping our people. Well, Jefferson well, first of all, the United States government's relatively poor. The United States government just contracted a navy. It's not in any war currently. It's not fighting France. It's not fighting Britain. So American sailors are being kidnapped by these Barbary pirates. And so Jefferson decides to act. He sends the Marines to what's modern-day Libya, to the Barbary's capital of Tripoli, which is on the coast of Africa. And the Marines siege these castles and sort of force the Barbary pirates to stop kidnapping American sailors and to sort of sign a treaty of peace. Again, this is Jefferson using the executive power far beyond what he seemed to have believed. Right? The Barbary War was not a official war because Congress did not sign off on it, but this expanded the military power of the government. And again, Jefferson was one of these people who was wary of a permanent military running things. So, with the Barbary Wars, Jefferson seems to be acting contradictory. But of course, if Jefferson's goal in using government is to defend the rights of the common man, what better way to use government than to protect American sailors who are being made victims, right? And we're going to see this again. Jefferson's goal is to defend the common American, right? If that means expanding the government, it means expanding the government. If it means limiting the government, it means limiting the government. He has his own political philosophy, but the political philosophy, I think, comes second. His goals as a politician structure how he views things. And so Jefferson's use of presidential power doesn't make him a hypocrite so much as adjusting his vision within the use of his own power when he can. Now, this whole thing about defending American sailors also leads Jefferson into one of the most challenging economic times the United States had faced. In 1807, Jefferson decides that since the British have not ceased to kidnap sailors, right, the Jay Treaty did nothing about that, and because British are sort of taking advantage of American trade, as a Southerner, as a Virginian, Jefferson has no love for Great Britain, and he does not agree with his New England allies, his New England countrymen, who depend upon trade with Great Britain. Right? Virginia has none of these major coastal cities. It does not depend upon trade as much as Boston or Charleston or Philadelphia or New York does. So Jefferson wants to sort of rein in British goods. He wants to punish Great Britain for its continued intransigence infringing upon American sovereignty. So he passes what's called the embargo. Right? It's a disastrous policy in the short term. Basically, the United States cuts off all trade with Britain, and basically the idea is to starve them as consumers. Right? Britain wants to buy American goods. Well, too bad, right? And America or Britain wants America to buy its manufacturers' goods. Too bad. Now, this policy sends a lot of merchants into ruin. It creates a black market basically overnight, which means American sailors and merchants keep doing business even though it's technically illegal. There's a lot of crime that starts cropping up, right? People just disregard Jefferson's intent. It intensifies British kidnapping of sailors, right? If the Americans are going to wage this economic warfare, then fine, we're just going to keep taking people. And so critics of Jefferson's policies, both within the Republicans and within the Federalists, they started to refer to this policy as "oh grab me," right? This is embargo backwards, and it was basically the effects, right? People were being robbed left and right. British piracy of Americans continued. But of course, Jefferson is doing this not to, right, and this is a political cartoon making fun of Jefferson, right? The United States is basically getting fleeced because Britain really didn't need the United States that much as a market, not as much as the United States needed Great Britain for trade. But Jefferson's trying to make a point. The United States as a sovereign nation, it should not depend upon other countries. Not to the point where it would go bankrupt if that country decided to cut off trade. So in this point, right, is where Jefferson begins to shift his opinions about manufacturing, right? And this will become a division within the Republican Party that will later blow up into the kind of melting down of the Republican Party. But nevertheless, right, Jefferson switches to supporting manufacturing. He doesn't see it as a cancer or a sore anymore, but that American manufacturing needs to produce for the United States so that the United States as a country does not have to depend on other nations. And so we're going to get into this a little bit more later, but this policy is known as protectionism. Right? It's the idea that you defend your own national interests, your own national markets, your own national productivity against the influence of foreign markets. So this is ultimately about trying to privilege the manufacturer, right? The opposite of protectionism is free trade. And Jefferson was mostly a free trader, meaning the idea that everyone should be able to trade with whoever they want. And this ultimately is to benefit the consumer, because the more people supposedly you can compete with, the lower the price would be. But of course, protectionism comes in because, right, if you're so dependent upon a foreign country's goods, they gain a kind of leverage over you. If they want to raise the rates, if they want to cut trade off, right, to threaten you over some other policy, this leaves your country kind of at the whims of another. And you can't really have national sovereignty without some level of self-dependence as a country, right? Producing your own goods and selling them within your own country, having your own internal market and your own internal producers. And so, while Jefferson was probably more of a free trader, he really cared about what this is sometimes called producerism, the idea that people need to be able to produce for themselves. Jefferson was thinking at the small level. Eventually, other Republicans within the party, which will split off and form other groups, they will be thinking at a much larger level, like building factories that employ lots of people. But of course, this contradicts Jefferson's idea of self-ownership. So a lot of these troubles start to influence the Republican Party, and it's from these issues of embargo, about use of the federal government, that the Republican Party will grow and grow and grow. Eventually, it will sort of absorb even the moderate Federalists, as we'll see. Um, but it will have its own internal divisions, right? And so if you look at any country, even countries that today are basically one-party states, there are internal divisions, right? There still are factions, even if only one party is in power. So Jefferson's election, right? He goes through to 1808. His reputation's bloodied pretty bad because of the ill effects of the embargo. Now, it's sort of an open gate or an open question about whether Jefferson shutting the gate on international trade really would have done anything. If it was always going to be a failure, you can make an argument that, well, if you continued the policy long enough and American manufacturing caught up, then yeah, the merchants would have been damaged, but the American economy would have recovered. But of course, this is long-term planning. This could have, in the short term, it seemed to be disastrous. It sent the country basically into a depression. So Jefferson's embargo only really lasted a year. Eventually, it's repealed, and right, the gates opened again, and international trade resumes once more. Nevertheless, even though this seems to have damaged Jefferson's reputation, the Republicans are in no way hurt. So by 1808, Jefferson steps down. His Secretary of State, James Madison, ascends to the presidency, and he wins in a pretty dominant landslide. As you can see, the Federalists are already in complete retreat. As I mentioned, moderate Federalists are being wooed into the Republican Party, and the Federalists are reduced basically down to a New England party, essentially representing the interests of Boston merchants and people who are linked to the trade with Great Britain that kind of flowed out of the northeast part of the country. Um, I can't tell you why Delaware and 2 votes from Maryland went Federalist or North Carolina, but Madison had clearly sort of shifted or Madison continued the Republican dominance and sort of shifted clearly into a one-party state. Like Jefferson, Madison really did not want war. So even though Jefferson was very hopped up in defense of the French Republic, even though Jefferson was willing to engage in a kind of economic warfare with Great Britain through the embargo, Madison, on the other hand, was even more peacenik than that. And on top of it, Madison really embraced Jefferson's sort of drift to being some people call it a moderate Republican. But I think it's just sort of coming to terms with, if you want to accomplish Jefferson's goals, you got to adjust how you use the federal government. So Madison continues this, and he begins to pass policies of using the federal government to develop the national interest. And in this case, and particularly in Madison's case, it means using the federal government to build a national road system. So the contrast with what went before was that in sort of the original idea, each state is supposed to develop its own roads, develop its own economic infrastructure. But Madison thinks for big projects, if we want to knit the nation together as a single unity, you're going to have to use the federal government to develop projects that cross multiple states. So one, this involves building large roads, and it will also, we'll see in later lectures, be used to develop large canal systems. We'll see it used to develop the beginnings of the railroad system. But the idea is that you have to think as a nation if you want to develop the good of all of the states. And if we just allow the states to sort of choose and pick their own interests, not only may things never get done because one or the other state is too poor to actually involve itself in such a large project, but states might become competitive with each other and trade within the country as a single market, as a single productive unit, will diminish. Now, within Madison's presidency, some storm clouds are already developing. If you're familiar with American history, right, the next major war that the United States fights is the uncreatively named War of 1812. So why does this happen, right? The rest of this lecture, we're going to kind of cover elements of this. But storm clouds are on the horizon. Bad things are about to happen. People are gearing up for war, for conflict. A new generation of Americans, right? Young people who did not exactly fight in the War of or in the American Revolution, or if they did fight, they were young men, right? Rising up, and now they're sort of taking office, and they're old enough to sort of be the figureheads of the nation. But conflict is on the horizon, right? And one of the major elements of this is coming from the West, namely Native Americans. Now, this guy here is named Tecumseh. Tecumseh will team up with a fellow Indian, and they will revive the Pan-Indian movement. Now, I already mentioned some of this. The original Pan-Indianism, which we saw in Pontiac's War, which happened after the 7 Years' War. If you forget what that is, just look up Pontiac's War. Right, that's where the name of the car brand comes from, if you're wondering. It's named after Pontiac, who was this great warrior. And you can just look that up, or you can revisit chapter 3 in your textbook, or week 3's lecture. But Tecumseh's channeling the spirit, right? Right. His idea of pan-Indianism, right, is drawing on kind of a combination of themes from a variety of different Indian national religious beliefs and kind of customs. It's also mixed in with some certain elements of Christianity. So people in the Pan-Indian movement who are seeing themselves collectively as Indians, right? That's why it's called Pan-Indian, right? They're not belonging to particular nations, right? People are saying, no, I'm an Indian first and foremost, which is becoming racialized. And it's not that, oh, I'm Cherokee, oh, I'm Choctaw, oh, I'm Chickasaw, I'm Mohawk, whatever, right? No, they're saying I'm predominantly an Indian, right? And the world between the Indians, the Reds, and the Whites is a gulf that's unfixed, you can't get across it, right? So they even believed, right, there are maybe 3 gods that created the world. There's the white god who made the white man, the red god who made the red man, and the black god who made the black man, right? But Tecumseh and his brother, who is just known as the prophet, the prophet was the preacher, Tecumseh was the warrior, and they kind of stir up at least some Indians who are suffering from the effects of displacement, from the sense that they have no place in the world anyway, that Americans, white Americans, are going to continue to pour west and west and west and take and take and take, right? So they don't see any other alternative but war. Now, like I say about Pan-Indianism in general, you see these spikes with Pontiac, you see a spike with Tecumseh, but generally it's not a popular movement. Most Indians do not think of themselves as Indians, just like most Americans don't think of themselves predominantly as white, though that's starting to change. They see themselves as American. They don't see themselves necessarily as the same as people back in Europe and as part of one big racial family, right? Again, that sort of changes and it differs on an individual level. But most people, right, like just today, like you don't think of yourself for first and foremost as an American probably. You think of yourself, if someone asks who are you, you think of yourself in terms of your direct family relationships, your job, the place you live in, maybe the city or the area. And maybe some of you think in kind of broader terms, religious, racial, cultural, social identities. But, I think a lot of people, they're not encompassing this big idea, right? They're just sort of getting on in their own life. But Tecumseh is thinking these big thoughts. He does see basically an apocalypse on the horizon, right? Either the red man's going to die or the white man's going to die. We need to fight. So he gathers an army and he wages war against the United States. Now, Britain is still present in Canada, and there are some British, whether government agents or private contractors, who are basically arming them, right? They need guns, they need ammunition, they need food supplies, blankets, etc. These kinds of things that you need for fighting a war and surviving. So the British are willing to sell these things to Tecumseh, and it seems like the British are interfering once again, right? This creates fear among Americans that the British, right? And we talked about this when we looked at the map in terms of geopolitical concerns, but we see the British are still scheming, right? We can't trust them, right? They're going to try to take away our independence. They're going to try to destroy us as a country, right? And it's all coming from the north. It's all seeping through Canada. So Tecumseh's War basically cemented that idea in some people's heads. Now, Tecumseh doesn't really last that long. He wins a string of battles, but eventually he's just defeated. The American army is much stronger. It's better equipped. It's got more money. And at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which makes a future president very famous, a man named you probably never heard of, William Henry Harrison. He's the general in charge of the battle, and he crushes Tecumseh in 1811. And even though Tecumseh's forces will continue to fight the United States, and they will actually join with the British during the War of 1812, Tecumseh himself has basically, he was crushed. And so this is the last major pan-Indian movement to try to at least overthrow the United States government. But it sort of sets the context for why Americans continue to racialize, right? Maybe some of them think, okay, Indians can, be brought together, or we can kind of deal with Indian nations. But for some Americans, right, no, the only good Indian's a dead Indian. There's no negotiating. They're just going to keep fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting, and we should exterminate them. All this comes to a head, right, with the War of 1812. Madison does not want to go to war, right? He's trying to find a way around it, but this group known as the Warhawks, which is a faction within the Republican Party, they're raring to go to war. And so all of these issues combine to sort of cause problems, or not cause problems, but to motivate the United States to declare war on Great Britain. So on the one hand, right, we talked about there's this constant issue for almost 20 years of taking ships or taking sailors, impressing them into the British Navy and using them to fight against the French, which for Republicans, right, that was their sister republic. Now Napoleon had kind of ruined that image, but for a long time, right, the French seem to be natural allies. They're both republics. They both want freedom, right? Another issue, right? The British are arming Indians, right? Our enemies, right? These people, right? Not all war Republicans or war hawks were against Indians or didn't think they could integrate, but they thought the British were stirring up the worst among them, right? Trying to create a race war that would destroy the United States, and they were doing that out of their bases in Canada. Now, a number of these war hawks, they were under this delusion that Canada was a hostage within the British Empire, that like all the other colonies, if the Americans could only liberate Canada, drive the British army out of Canada, then the Canadians would join with the United States and become, the next couple of states and join the Union. This was all misguided. Most Canadians wanted nothing to do with the United States. Many people who fled to Canada during and after the American Revolution were loyalists, so that these were people who wanted to stay under the British Crown. And then you had the issue of the French there. The French-speaking people, right? Canada was originally a French colony. They settled in a territory, a part of Canada known as Quebec, and the people there are known as Quebecois. They were predominantly French-speaking. They were Roman Catholic, and they had gotten a pretty good deal under the British monarch, right? The British allowed them to practice their faith, allowed them to live the lives of Frenchmen. They didn't have to learn English, except for the purposes of business and, in engaging with the government. But most people in this time spoke French. It was considered the civilized language of diplomacy and poetry and philosophy. So Most people already knew French, who were engaged in higher forms of diplomacy, but it basically allowed these people to live their own lives and not be bothered to conform to anything. So many of the Quebecois were worried that in the United States they would lose these privileges. There was a lot of hostility, if not bigotry, to the Roman Catholic Church, and we'll talk about that more and why that was the case in a later lecture. Um, but they had no interest in joining the United States. They were quite happy being British subjects, and so the Warhawks, were rather had deceived themselves into thinking everyone wanted to be American. Anyway, all of these issues create the perfect storm, and the Warhawks pass a bill in Congress, which, a declaration of war. They put it on Madison's desk, and the pressures of all of these issues force him to sign it, right? He becomes the war president he never wanted to be. Now, there's a kind of irony in all of this, because Madison had been sending diplomats to Great Britain. This issue of kidnapping sailors was of a huge importance to him. And he actually kind of hammered out an agreement with the British government, promising neutrality, in some other favorable things, and in return, the British would stop kidnapping and stop impressing American sailors and American ships. So one of the major causes for the war was actually solved before the war even began. Nevertheless, right, information travels very slowly, right? You go overseas on a boat, takes, over a month to get there. You have to talk with people, you make out, agreements. And so whether you yourself personally or you send a messenger, you still have to wait over a month to get reports back and forth between the United States and Great Britain to even find out what had happened. So by the time this agreement was made and news was sent back to the United States, war was already declared. Now, the war basically is a disaster. The United States kind of expected this quick mopping up of the British, and such was not the case. The United States sends an army into Canada. It goes to Quebec City, which is the capital of Quebec, and burns the city's mayor palace to the ground, seeking to liberate the citizens or the subjects of the British Crown from Great Britain and allow Quebec to be a free country. But like I said, the Quebecois were not receptive to the Americans, and so Americans were sort of disillusioned and upset, right? Why don't they want to be free? Right? A lot of people couldn't understand that. However, this was a great blow to Great Britain. They burned down the imperial palace that was, where the governor of Canada resided, at least a functionary of the British Crown. So anyway, the British get their revenge. During this period, there's actually, we won't get into all the details, but there's a break in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon signs a peace treaty with Great Britain, and allows Great Britain to kind of basically pursue its own ends. Now, I won't get into all the history of, Napoleon's rise and fall, and then his rise again. Right? He'll try to invade Russia, get knocked down, deposed. But anyway, all that aside, the British have a free hand, so they sail some ships to the U.S. The Star-Spangled Banner was written during this period because so that the British can get to Washington, D.C., they have to pass by Fort McHenry in Maryland. They bombard the fort. So a young kind of patriot by the name of Francis Scott Key, he witnesses the British blasting Fort McHenry, and yet Fort McHenry kind of survived. They eventually kind of just allowed the British to pass, but the fort was not taken, and so this inspires the lyrics for the Star-Spangled Banner. So if you look over those lyrics, you can probably see what I'm talking about, right? Bombs bursting in air, and yet the flag remained, right? That was the whole point. It was this kind of glorious defense, Americans standing up for themselves against the might of the British Empire, which still was the world's most powerful government. So anyway, the U.S. can't stop the British Navy. The British Navy lands its Marines. They make a trek for Washington, D.C. Madison and his government flee the capital into Virginia. Dolly Madison, his wife, is famous for saving a lot of the portraits. So the portraits of George Washington, right? She didn't want those being captured by the British because, of course, they would take them as trophies back to London. But when they get there, the British burn down the presidential mansion. Now, I'm calling this the White House so that you know what I'm talking about. But at this time, the house that the president lived in was actually gray colored, and it's burnt to the ground. So when it's reconstructed later in the administration, um, it will be painted white, and ever since then, it will be known as the White House. But anyway, they burned the presidential mansion down, and then the British, right? There's not really anything in Washington D.C. There isn't wealth. They're just tiny little towns. So there's nothing really to do there. So the British pack their bags, get back on their ships, and they consider it a job well done, right? Proving to the Americans, right? You gotta like watch out, right? You burn our government building down in Quebec, we'll burn your capital down, right? Nevertheless, right, Americans are able to kind of hold their own. They don't capitulate, the government doesn't collapse. The fear that during any kind of wartime crisis, the United States federal government would turn into some kind of dictatorship, whether under the president or the Congress or something, or maybe a general would, declare that he's now the ruler of the United States. None of this stuff happens, right? War of 1812 proves that the United States can kind of stand on its own. 1814 rolls by, right? There's not really any. There's one major. We won't get into it. There's a major U.S. naval victory in the Great Lakes, but the United States really doesn't win very many battles. It survives, but it doesn't win that much, and so a peace treaty is kind of hammered out in the city of Ghent, which is in Belgium. And the United States and Britain kind of hammer out their differences, respect the sovereignty of the U.S., and kind of puts bygones, makes bygones be bygones. However, this is the funny thing, right? Again, it takes a long time to get the news. The British didn't know the war was over, and the Americans didn't know the war was over. So while the peace treaty is being hammered out in Europe, a force of British Marines tries to land in New Orleans, right? And the idea was if you could take New Orleans, you could get control of the Mississippi. If you can get control of the Mississippi, you can split the country in half. So the United States meet them there under the command of a rapidly rising star, a man by the name of Andrew Jackson. Jackson wins a stunning battle against the British, right? He blows them away, right? It's not even close. The Americans lose like less than a dozen soldiers, and the British lose hundreds. This is this totally failed amphibian invasion, and the Americans hold their own. And Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans becomes a national hero, and so that's what this picture of that's what this picture is, right? That's General Jackson standing victoriously, holding back the British, driving them back into the ocean, and defending the cause of the United States. So, real quick, you might want to just jot these down. These are the ultimate kind of cash out effects of the War of 1812. The United States proves that it can sort of survive as a country, right? It didn't collapse. The country didn't split in half. Now, we won't get into it too much, but there was actually a conspiracy among a few elites in New England. They met together to think about secession, right? And why were they doing that? Because as merchants, by going to war with Britain, their trade was impacted. So they meet together in Connecticut at what's called the Hartford Convention. They can't really decide on what to do. It's very risky, right? They're basically committing treason, saying we're going to break from the United States government, find our own peace with the British, and restart trade with them. Now, it doesn't really come to anything, but the idea that part of the country was going to secede kind of raised the specter that the United States could not survive during a war, but it does. And so the war, even though it doesn't have very many great battles, and the greatest victory that the United States has technically happens after the war is already over, but it proves that the United States can hang with the big guys. It's not going to destroy the government, and that the United States as a whole, right, as a nation, right, not just Virginia, not just Massachusetts, not just Pennsylvania, not just random states that are kind of meeting together, but as a national unity, as a country, as a single people, right, this war sort of proved to many, right, that was the new reality. So the Warhawks, they're emboldened, right, rather than saying, oh man, we didn't do as good as we thought, right, we didn't get to capture Canada. No, they're emboldened. They see a new horizon that the United States needs to invest in its own national development so that it can become a world power to compete with the British, the French, and all the other Europeans. Now, Madison ends his second term in 1816, and then he's succeeded by his Secretary of State, James Monroe. Now, James Monroe, he's known as sort of the last revolutionary, the last founder. He was probably one of the youngest to sort of be among that revolutionary generation, and so he's kind of the longest lasting. So James Monroe's presidency is sort of the last of the original founding generation to be kind of leading the United States government. But nevertheless, right, the pattern continues. Monroe dominates, the election. Federalists are still stuck as this tiny regional party. More and more of them are defecting and joining the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is really, or the Democratic Republican Party, it's also sometimes known as the National Republican Party after this period. They're all kind of, it's the only game in town, and more people are joining it. Now, like I said, there are many different factions. We're going to talk more about Cotton in another lecture. But right, there are many different parts of the country that even though they're nominally all part of the same party, they have very different ideas of what that should be. So for the South, cotton is, plantation slavery and cotton is the big deal. For, Philadelphia and New York, it involves finance. We're going to get, when we talk about the bank, when you're going to learn about the bank during the documentary on Jackson, Madison will reap, right, even though Jefferson opposed Hamilton's Bank of the United States, it only exists for so many years before it has to get rechartered. So during Madison's presidency, the Bank of the United States, it then becomes known as the Second Bank of the United States. It gets rechartered. And the point of it was, even though this was a private bank, it was increasingly apparent to people like Madison that this bank needs to be used to help develop not merchants, not trade, but manufacturing. So you have the beginning of kind of industrialists starting up in places like Pennsylvania and New York. Massachusetts backcountry becomes highly industrialized. We'll get into that when we look at the changing nature of American society in a few weeks from now. But that's just to kind of give you a sense of what's about to happen. But all of these people see themselves as a part of the Democratic Republican Party. And they will split and eventually cause the second party system to arise. But we'll learn more about that later. And so from within the Republican Party, even though it's the party of Jefferson, right, it's supposed to be the party of small government, you have Republicans who are now calling themselves national Republicans, that even though they believe in the Constitution as, to be strictly interpreted, they don't like Hamilton, they don't like privileging finance, they do believe finance, industry, manufacturing, all these things need to be used, and the federal government needs to be used to help knit the country together as a single political entity. However, right, there are people in the Republican Party that fear that pushing too far, privileging these private groups to help develop the country, like the Second Bank of the United States, that's going to lead to the corruption and the privilege that Jefferson feared was prevalent and dominant in Hamilton's rule and reign during the Washington administration and during the Adams administration. So I'm going to pause here real quick and shift into a more international dimension to sort of explain some other things going on in the United States, right? I think it's important. You got to understand what's going on in the world to understand how that impinges upon what's going on in the United States society, its politics, all that stuff. So I want to talk about Latin American independence. Right. This all begins during our period, right? This is at the end of Jefferson, in the beginning of Madison's administration, yep. And this guy here, his name is Simon Bolivar. He is super important. If you're Latin American, you should definitely know who this is. If you don't know who this is, that's, shame on you. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, he's like a super patriot. He's Washington, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, all these people rolled up into one, right? Simon Bolivar, he gives the name of, Bolivia is named after him. He becomes president, which is president for life, in his newly liberated country of Gran Colombia, which is made up of several different South American countries. We won't get into all that. He writes constitutions for several of these countries. He's He's a successful general. He's a political philosopher, right? He helps liberate and free Latin America from the Spanish Empire. Now, Bolivar was a wealthy elite. He was born in Venezuela, so that makes him a Creole. If you remember from week 2, where we discussed that there's like a class system based on race within Latin America. So Bolivar, he's 100% he's 100% Spaniard, right? He's Spanish, but he's born in Latin America. And so that kind of knocks him down the totem pole, so he can't get access to the highest rungs of government. But Bolivar is dreaming big dreams. He sees what's taking place in the United States. He's seeing what's taking place in France, and he wants that for his own homeland. So Bolivar helps wage, right? He wages some unsuccessful campaigns. He wages some very successful campaigns. We won't get into all the details, but just to give a short story, during the first decade of the 1800s, France invades Spain. Napoleon puts his brother in charge of the Spanish government. He makes him the king. The Spanish government in charge, which is a royal government, the old king, they kind of flee into exile. Spain becomes riven by civil war, where the French are basically chasing around ex-royalist troops, trying to fight them, trying to subdue the country. The British show up and start attacking the French all over the Spanish coast. So there's a TV show about this. It's called Sharp, but that was from a while ago. So don't worry about that. Nevertheless, right, Bolivar uses this opportunity to basically force Spain's hand. The Spanish government seems too weak. Many governments in Latin America, they try to defend themselves from any French invasion. But of course, by taking up arms, by consolidating themselves as governments, this starts to give them experience of what independence would look like. This is all sort of accidental, but the end result is that Bolivar leads armies. He liberates Latin America. Spain is an empire in decline at this point, so it can't really reclaim. It tries to fight, but it's unsuccessful. And of course, if you look at Spanish America, which is Central America, so it's from Mexico all the way down to Argentina, that's a massive place, right? And Bolivar is not alone. There are many different, right? We're going to learn more about Mexican independence in a different lecture. Argentine and Chilean independence is going to come from a different figure, but Bolivar is one of these central characters. And so, drawing on the idea of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, Bolivar sets up his own governments and pursues a totally free America. At the same time, right, Spain is having problems with its other colony, Florida. A group of Indians that was sort of coalescing into a new nation known as the Seminoles, which is where Florida State gets its mascot name from, or its actual people group. The Seminoles were waging war against the Americans who are living in Georgia. They were kind of raiding them and attacking them. And so the United States government decides secure the border, keep the Seminoles from raiding, and lock them into Florida. However, the general who was in charge of keeping them in their place was none other than the war hero Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson believed that these Seminoles were not acting on their own accord, but were being encouraged and armed by the British. So right, Jackson's carrying on that Jeffersonian anti-British phobia. And in this case, Jackson's actually correct. So Jackson breaks the law. He disregards the extent of his military command. Rather than just securing the border between Georgia and Florida, Jackson invades. He beats the Seminoles into Florida, and he discovers that in their camp he finds 2 British merchants, right, who may or may not have been government spies. Jackson's convinced that they're government spies. The case is probably they were working on behalf of the British government, in the same case that the British merchants and military figures were arming Tecumseh and the Indians in Canada. And so Jackson, executes military justice, right? He hangs them and puts them to death, right? This creates an international crisis because, as you might expect, 2 subjects of the British crown were just murdered. I mean, that's how the British saw it, by an unhinged American general. Now, for Jackson, this was protecting American sovereignty. These were spies. They were arming and equipping an enemy force to basically harass, rob, and potentially kill American citizens. Now, a guy in government at this time we're going to learn a little bit about in just a minute, John Quincy Adams. He is the Secretary of State at the time under James Monroe, and he backs Jackson to a hill, right? The United States cannot allow European powers to chip away at their sovereignty. Now, during this period, there are other Republicans, right? John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, he wants to defend the United States as a single republic. Other Republicans, particularly a guy we're going to learn more about, you're going to learn more about next week and the week after, a man named Henry Clay. He thinks the United States should be involved in basically international revolution. The U.S. should be sending troops down to Latin America. The U.S. should be actively freeing all parts of the United States, or not just the United States, but all parts of the Americas from European influence. So, of course, Henry Clay was one of the war hawks, as you might expect. He led the charge to invade Canada, right? Believing the Canadians wanted to be free from British rule and also wanted to be absorbed by the United States. And he also wanted Spanish America to be free. However, John Quincy Adams is opposed to this kind of international approach. He does not believe revolution should be spreading everywhere. Rather, John Quincy Adams is a nationalist. He believes that the United States needs to protect its own interests. And so in the case of Florida, that means sending Jackson, even though Jackson exceeded his military commands, he was well within his right to execute the British who were there, to put down the Seminoles, and to invade Spanish territory. The Spanish were not protecting it. They were harboring foreign allies, right? They were allowing the British to basically operate there without doing anything. So Adams defends Jackson, and as Secretary of State, he hammers out a treaty between the United States and the Spanish government. It's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, and this is why Florida, which was technically two different colonies at the time, it was called, that's why this is plural, Floridas. But Adams acquires Florida for the United States, and that's how Florida becomes a state. However, Adams's influence continues. This is called the Monroe Doctrine because it's named after the president, James Monroe. But as Secretary of State, Adams basically wrote the contents of this speech. And Monroe goes before Congress and announces America's new foreign policy. And this will last for about 100 years. And the foreign policy is this. The United States will not tolerate any other European empire, with the exception of Britain, because of its trade. But that's sort of... that's like an asterisk. The United States will not allow other European powers to come and try to dominate the Americas. Americans should be free to do what they need to do. If they want independence, they can pursue it. If they want to live under the authority of a European power, they can do that too. But European powers should not be meddling in the affairs of American countries. And the United States will defend the rights of itself and of any of its neighbors if a European, whether it's Spain, France, Britain's kind of gets an exception because they don't really have much of an empire in Latin America at least. But any European power, they're locked out, and the United States commits itself to this. Now, of course, the U.S. Navy is relatively weak. It's not going to be patrolling. It's not an imperial doctrine where the United States is going to go around trying to control the rest of the Americas, and that will kind of become the case in the 20th century, but that's way beyond their class. Instead, John Quincy Adams is basically announcing that American sovereignty needs to take precedence, and Europeans are not permitted to intervene or interfere, or they will suffer the consequences. Just like those two British merchants, those two British spies, those two British military attaches, they will be hung as enemy combatants. So this basically sets the American mood for foreign policy, and it kind of continues from this national sense that the United States is not just this little baby nation. It's not an experiment. It's not ambiguous, right? European powers aren't going to be able to manipulate or control it, but the Monroe Doctrine firmly cements in the minds of European politicians that the United States is a force to be reckoned with. So we're going to shift gears here and now get into the issues of slavery in the United States, right? We haven't really talked too much about the mass of people who are held under bondage in states like South Carolina and Virginia. So as you might know, many of the American founders, right, the people who participated in the Revolution as patriots and people who helped design the Constitution at the convention in 1787, they were deeply uncomfortable with slavery. Um, Now, this might make a lot of sense if you think about it, right? Here they are promoting freedom, promoting liberty. Thomas Jefferson, even when he's writing the Declaration of Independence, even compares the state of the United States, or the state of the Americans in the colonies, as basically slaves of George III. We talked about that binary between British and French, civilized and savage, and one of those binaries was free and slave, right? The French king keeps his people as slaves, as the British king keeps his people free. Then during the American Revolution, that's turned against the British, that the British king is keeping his people slaves, and only an independent American republic can defend the free rights of Americans, or Englishmen and then Americans, right? And this becomes a distinctly American idea. But you talk that big game, what about all the people you hold in bondage, right? Some Americans are starting to feel really uncomfortable. Um, in the North, ranging from New England all the way down to Pennsylvania, the new state governments pass laws that ban slavery. Um, Now, a key theme in this class is paying attention to economics and material development. So, in Massachusetts, you didn't really own slaves unless you wanted a house servant. And the same thing for Pennsylvania. You had a slave who functioned as like an apprentice if you were a blacksmith, or you needed a slave to basically help you do your to help run your shop or make rope or do these kind of tiny manufacturing operations. But slavery was not that important to the economy, so slavery could basically be wiped out with a stroke of a pen. But slavery was super important to the South. In Virginia and North Carolina, slavery was linked to growing tobacco, which kind of had its ups and downs as a crop, as a sort of a commodity to sell on the world market. But South Carolina, it was deeply connected to the wealth of these swamp planters who grow rice and indigo. And if you remember from week 2, rice is big bucks. At the same time, roughly right as the Constitution is being hammered out, there's a new crop. We're going to learn a lot more about this in another lecture. But a new crop is becoming the key cash crop of the South, and that's cotton. Right? Write cotton down. Underline it. Circle it. Cotton defines. You can't understand American history without cotton. If you think you understand it and you don't even know what cotton is for, right, you know nothing. So really, really, really important, write cotton down, right? You can't understand the Civil War without cotton. You can't understand the South without cotton. You can't understand slavery. You can't understand racism without cotton, right? Cotton, as one Southern patriot and politician would say later, cotton is king, right? But we're going to get into that in another lecture. Back to the revolutionary generation, right? They're deeply uncomfortable, but they depend upon slavery for their livelihoods. So one South Carolina elite who's at the convention, he will refer to his slaves as our black peasantry, right? Like they're European serfs. They have some rights, they're people. It's not such a bad situation, right? The fact that he has to call it this, and we're going to get to another figure later, John C. Calhoun, and in a later period, slavery will get a full-throated defense saying, no, slavery is actually what makes the United States good. And for that reason, right, John C. Calhoun will be called by at least one commentator, the most evil man in American history. And while that might be true, that's debatable, and I would probably argue against it because there are way more evil politicians in American history. But I won't get into that. John C. Calhoun, even if he is evil, he's brilliant, and he articulates this new way of viewing slaves. But at this moment, slavery is a very uncomfortable reality. And someone like Thomas Jefferson, even though he's a racist, he does believe whites are superior to blacks, he does not want slavery to continue in the United States. So when you look at history, you got to be able to appreciate, cause and effect and kind of personal idiosyncrasies. So Thomas Jefferson, yeah, he does not believe black people have the same intellectual abilities as white people. He does racialize them. It's biological. He thinks it has to do, right, at this time, ideas of evolution and natural development of peoples are starting to take root among some in the scientific community and the philosophical world. This is all before Darwin, by the way. Um, but Jefferson is reading this stuff and possibly believes it, right? He speculates that maybe black people are just biologically inferior, right? It has to do with where they were created. Jefferson is not a Christian in any conventional sense, right? He kind of defines himself as he's a very heterodox Christian at the very least. It means he's way out on the fringe. Um, but some people are starting to kind of reject the narrative that you find in the Bible in Genesis that God made man. He created Adam and Eve, and then the rest of the world sort of flows out of them. Jefferson says, well, maybe there's actually different origins of people. They evolve differently. So the European races evolved one way, Africans are evolved another way, and that's why one group's inferior and another group is inferior. Or one group is superior and one group is inferior. Nevertheless, even though Jefferson believes these things, or is at least speculating about them, he does not like slavery. And it's for and you have to thank Jefferson for kind of drawing the line that prevents slavery from spreading anywhere north. So he's not long in power as Secretary of State. He signed something called the Northwest Ordinance. And this means that any federal territory, so parts of the United States that aren't actually states yet, any new territories brought into the country, slavery is banned there. So Jefferson keeps slavery from spreading to places like Ohio and Indiana and maybe even as far as Michigan, all of which had territorial claims from Virginia. So it was a very conceivable reality that Virginia influencing Ohio would make Ohio a slave state. It's very possible. So Jefferson kind of locks that out and draws a line through the map. And this line will be cemented in what will be called the Missouri Compromise. Slave states are concerned about the effects of free states, right? Free states are concerned about the effects of slave states. Slave states don't want slavery being curtailed. Free states don't want slavery being spread. A lot of this is economic. Part of it is about the concern for the future of the country. 1821 rolls around. A guy you're going to hear more about in the documentary you're going to watch, Henry Clay, he helps pass what's called the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise is a development from Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance. So while the Northwest Ordinance acquired the territory that will become Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, etc., Missouri Compromise draws a line right down the United States map and says no slaves above that, and slavery is allowed to exist below it. So this is this is basically how it cashes out, right? Everything south of Missouri, which technically includes parts of Illinois, but that whole unit is being treated as a single state, so it doesn't count. Right, this line would be drawn so that everything to the north of that, right, includes Michigan, includes all this federal territory, includes the Oregon country that Jefferson had helped discover by sending out. Right, that's the whole story of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. Right, all of that would be free territory, meaning no slaves. Of course, this meant Arkansas and some of this territory acquired. That will be later acquired from Mexico, is all open to slavery. And so this is going to provoke a crisis in American politics, but it stops slavery from becoming the norm potentially anywhere. And there were people who wanted to bring slavery into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Right, Illinois is right next to Kentucky. Right, here's a southern state that has slaves. Henry Clay had slaves. He was sort of uncomfortable with slavery. He never becomes an advocate for the institution, as they call it, the peculiar institution. He's always somewhat uncomfortable with it, but he's always a compromiser. Slavery can exist in certain places, right? He's also a racist, right? Black people are inferior, white people are a single group. They need to be considered as a whole, right? That's basically the definition of a racist, somebody who believes that races essentially exist, that they're kind of God-given or baked into nature. They're not products of history or culture. It's not just a phenomenon that develops and might disappear one day. Um, but they believe it's real, it's permanent, it's fixed, and it's always going to be with us. So, that's how Clay thought, but Clay was uncomfortable with slavery, so he's trying to keep it within a certain boundary, right? And like I said, Clay has slaves in Kentucky, but he doesn't mean he wants slavery to expand further to the north. Um, so this kind of sets the stage for future problems, but it limits how far slavery can go. Now, another thing going on, right, while slavery is trying to be hammered out, while it's trying to be curtailed or limited, or, in Jefferson's idea that slavery was basically on its way out anyway, um, tobacco was not very profitable, and especially if the United States becomes a self-dependent country, it becomes its own producer, it becomes its own market. How many people smoke cigarettes? You can only smoke so many cigarettes. It goes boom bust in this cycle, and so eventually, you know, slavery will burn itself out as long as you can kind of hold it in place. And the only place where slavery is very lucrative is in South Carolina, and that's a tiny little bubble, and eventually the whole country could turn against that. So Jefferson, Madison truly believed that slavery would burn itself out, right? They did not foresee the effects of cotton. They didn't predict any of that, and that will be a game changer. But we'll come to that later. Another concern about maintaining the institution of slavery was the fear that eventually a people who are kept in bondage will eventually turn against their masters and desire freedom. Right? There's plenty of histories of slave revolts as far back as, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the story of Spartacus, either because you learned it in a class or because you watched the TV shows or the movies. Um, Not necessarily historically accurate, but Spartacus is a famous symbol of slave revolt, that one of these days slaves are going to come for their masters and they're going to want to be free. Whether or not they want to get rid of slavery everywhere, they want to be free. And over the 18th century, plenty of slave revolts happened throughout the Americas. There was slave revolts in Jamaica. There was a slave revolt called Stono's Rebellion in South Carolina. And the United States was no different. In 1803, you'll see in your textbook, I won't get into it too much, there was an attempted slave revolt within Richmond, Virginia called Gabriel's Rebellion. Gabriel was a slave. He had learned to read. He started creating a secret network among some slaves and some kind of poor urban workers, some of whom were black, some of whom were white. And Gabriel believed that if he can start a revolt and kidnap the governor of Virginia, who at that time was James Monroe, and he could hold him hostage and force Virginia to abolish slavery, and he would be joined by all of the sort of non-slave owning elements in Virginian society. And the vast majority of Virginia did not own slaves, so the idea, and there were free blacks, there were poor whites who owned small farms or worked in the cities, and he believed that they would all unite together and force Monroe to sign an abolition bill. Now this failed. Gabriel's plan gets he gets snitched on. Gabriel gets arrested and he's executed. Now another major element to this fear began in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Now I'm just going to give a real short history of this because this is also super complicated. Maybe not as long and multivalent as the French Revolution, but it's pretty complicated. And that's the Haitian Revolution. Haiti, right, is Saint-Domingue. It's the French island. It's a sugar island. It's a cotton island. Most of the slaves there are being imported from Africa. The labor is so extreme, right? Haiti's basically a swamp. It's it's an island. While parts of it are mountainous, other parts of it are very coastal. And so a lot of people are worked to death. If they're not dying from diseases due to malnutrition, spread of mosquitoes, all that nasty stuff, they're also just getting worked to death. Like I mentioned, sugar production is horrible. It's super work intensive. And of course, right, what do you care, right? You can work your slave to death like a machine. That's how some of these slave owners thought. They owe nothing to them. Yes, there were legal codes in Saint-Domingue. The king in the 17th century passed something called the Black Code, and this was what rights do you have as an enslaved black person, and they did have rights. they could petition the king. But most slave owners just ignored it, and most government figures as slave owners didn't really care to enforce it. So it was kind of hit or miss. But some slaves knew about this, and they'd use this kind of for their own benefit. Now, to make a long story short, um, a number of the slaves, right, they knew some of their rights. They knew some of the agitation going on back in Europe. They have a massive revolt, right? They have this huge rebellion where slaves on several plantations rise up against their masters and seek to overthrow them. Now, why they did this is up for dispute. It wasn't because they were acting in the belief of the French Revolution. They didn't think they were pursuing freedom, like in the case of the American Revolution. It might actually be the case that they were rising up against their masters on behalf of the French king. So some of the slaves who rebelled, they waved the French fleur de lis, which is the royal flag, right? Not the tricolor, not the red, white, and blue that you expect if you look up France's flag now. That's the revolutionary flag. They weren't waving that flag. They didn't even really know anything about that. They were asking for the French king, or in some cases even the Spanish king, to come and help them against their corrupt masters who were breaking the law, mistreating them, and not allowing them their due rights. Eventually, this rebellion will metastasize, it will transform, and it will be explicitly linked with the promises of the French Revolution. And particularly a guy named Toussaint Louverture, he will become the general in charge of this Haitian Revolution. Now, Louverture will eventually die in exile. He will go to France to negotiate and get tricked and kidnapped and locked in a jail cell in Switzerland where he'll die. But the Haitian Revolution will continue on. It will continue to fight battles. Napoleon gets concerned, right? There are some people in France who are perfectly happy with trying to abolish slavery in Saint-Domingue, but they want the country to belong not as an independent nation, but to still belong to France. There are other revolutionaries who, like American revolutionaries, see no contradiction between the cry of freedom and the ownership of slaves. Right? And so, I mean, during the American Revolution, even the British sometimes found this silly. A social commentator named Samuel Johnson, he was a very famous literary critic. He'll remark that no one yelps louder for freedom than the American driver of Negroes. So there's this irony that they're the ones who cry loudest for freedom are the ones who oppress people the most. And so anyway, nevertheless, some French saw no contradiction between this. Eventually, Napoleon, when he assumes control of the government, he'll see that Haiti is getting out of control. It's basically independent under this black government. And Toussaint Louverture was not willing to negotiate, so Napoleon's the one who tricks him to come to France and locks him in a jail cell. But Louverture is not the only one. Napoleon decides that Saint-Domingue is too far gone. It needs to be brought back into the fold by force. So France, under Napoleon, sends this massive navy, tries to invade Haiti, doesn't work. Eventually, the armies of these freed slaves will defeat Napoleon's army. That's a very complicated period, but nevertheless, the end goal of this is that Haiti declares itself as a free and independent nation, and it will have a series of problems after this, but it will also be treated as an international pariah. Under Jefferson, the United States will break off trade relationships with the new Haitian government, which had pre-existed under John Adams, kind of strangely. But the idea that motivated many people like Jefferson was that if their own slaves find out about Haiti, if they find out about the influences of slaves rising up and creating their own independent nation, then the plantation owners of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, right, they're all under threat. Their slaves, if they hear this, they might try something and might be successful. And even though Jefferson is somewhat uncomfortable with slavery, he wants to get rid of it, he does not want to be massacred in the pursuit of black liberation. And so, while this seems to be at one level a kind of conspiracy, right? This paranoia that, oh, the slaves are going to find out about Haiti and they're going to take action. There is some legitimate sense for fear. There's a guy named Denmark Vesey. He'll be a Methodist preacher, so he's going out trying to convert people to Christianity. He's learned how to read. He becomes somewhat involved in contemporary affairs, and he knows about Haiti. Denmark Vesey takes some inspiration from what goes on in Haiti. He sails to South Carolina. He tries to create a slave revolt. This fails, and he's eventually executed. But this only convinces South Carolina planters, who are increasingly dependent upon slavery connected to rice, but also cotton. Right, this needs to be cut down quickly. We need to kind of intensify slavery. We need to make sure that none of them read, none of them find out about Haiti. We really need to clamp down. So another element to this fear was that in 1804, the government of Haiti decides to wipe out all of the French planters, all of the old slave masters, and this is interpreted as a white massacre or kind of racial genocide. Now, this isn't actually true. There were a number of French people who had useful skills that the government did not kill. There were also a bunch of Polish immigrants who got stuck there from Napoleon's army who integrated into Haiti. There were also some Germans coming to Haiti. But all the old French plantation owners are executed. This is basically class warfare, right? Wipe out the old masters so that they won't enslave us, and that the French will have no reason to come back to try to reconquer the island because there's no one to run the plantations, so there's no way they'd ever bring back slavery. And a kind of funny thing about Haiti's original constitution was that it declared all people who lived in Haiti after this massacre were now black. So even if you had white skin, you were black now. And that Haiti would be intentionally designed as a black republic. However, people in the United States and people in Europe, they heard about this as a race war. And so this kind of political cartoon existed, showing, right, white babies being nailed to boards, executed by angry freed slaves, right? This guy here is getting his head sawed off. This guy's tied upside down, and he's probably going to get sawed in half. And some of this massacre, some of this did happen. It just wasn't strictly race-based. It had to do with wiping out the old master class, and in some ways it was this kind of incredibly violent reaction to almost 15 years of civil war. Right? France invaded. Some people joined with France. Some people joined with the independence movement, and this is sometimes the violent repercussions of civil war, right? When people are done fighting, they get revenge, and the winners devour the losers. And so this is basically what this was. So yes, there were cases where people's heads were sawn off, babies were drowned or executed, people were cut in half or shot or stabbed or hung or burnt alive. But this scared the hell out of people, and so this only intensified the need to make Haiti a sort of pariah state. Right? Nobody would trade with Haiti, no one would interact with Haiti, and it helped contribute to making Haiti one of the poorest countries in the world at the time. To wrap up, I just want to give a quick bio and account of John Quincy Adams because he's going to become important later in the class. As you might think, John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams. He got this nickname, or he got his middle name from where he was born. Now, as a very young boy, John Quincy Adams went off to serve his father in the cause of the American Revolution. So he was a diplomat. He spoke several foreign languages. He was at one point in Russia as the American diplomat at the court of Queen Catherine, or Empress Catherine of all of Russia. Now, when John Quincy Adams begins his political career, he follows in his father's footsteps as a Federalist. But also, like his father, John Quincy Adams thought for himself. John Adams will leave the Federalist Party around 1808, and long before that, John Quincy Adams will convert to the cause of the Republican Party. He will announce himself as a firm Jeffersonian, and he will defend. He will basically lead the charge to convert Massachusetts from a Federalist stronghold into being a Republican one. But like many other national Republicans, John Quincy Adams' Republican ideas is in line with kind of Jefferson's later turn, which is the belief that if America is going to be a free country, it needs to provide for itself. It needs its own markets, it needs its own manufacturing, it can't rely on foreign trade, and it can't be involved in the affairs of all the other countries. So John Quincy Adams, one of the famous things he said is that the United States is not a country in search of monsters to slay. It's not going to go around looking for bad people to beat up. It's not going to go to war trying to influence foreign relations elsewhere. It only will act for its own self-interest. So that's the definition of being a nationalist. John Quincy Adams is also going to pursue national development. He's a firm believer that the national government, the federal government, should help develop the country, help build roads, help engage in all these infrastructure projects. He believes in the idea of a national bank. He actually pursues building a university. So John Quincy Adams will eventually go on to be elected president, and many of his ideas are made fun of. He wants to build a national observatory to engage in astronomical work, looking at the stars, figuring out stuff about space and navigation. He wants to build like an Oxford for the United States, a public-owned university that would train the best and brightest for government service. That's rejected, but this is all kind of, this is a lot of information, but John Quincy Adams will, as Secretary of State, he'll try to succeed James Monroe. But in 1824, the Republican Party starts to get fractured. Adams and Clay, who are very similar on some things, they will split. Crawford, a guy named Crawford, who's is a congressman from Georgia, he'll represent old Republicans, so the idea of reining in these new national Republicans about trying to make the federal government smaller in a more strictly constitutional sense and not necessarily following Jefferson and his ideas of economic democracy. And then you also have the campaign of Andrew Jackson. Jackson's political views are not fully developed at this point, but he has the backing of many Southerners because Jackson himself, even though he will promote himself as the defender of the common man, he himself is a wealthy plantation owner. But you're going to learn more about that in the documentary. All I want you to focus on right here is this idea that under the Adams administration, he will pursue what's called the American system. This is this idea that the government needs to develop the infrastructure, it needs to take national priority in kind of developing its economy, and you should not let that happen by random forces that are happening all over the globe. So he's against strict free trade, which means the government doesn't do anything to intervene between how people buy and sell and the movement of capital. Adams wants the government to develop things within the country, and he wants the military to be used to protect America's interests, right? And so that's how Adams will acquire Florida as a territory. Right? It's not quite a state yet, but it belongs to the United States now. And that's what he tries to pursue in his presidency. Of course, as you'll learn in the documentary, Adams wins this presidency very barely. There's not enough. No candidate has a majority, so they take it to Congress. Henry Clay gets knocked out. You'll learn more about this documentary. Henry Clay gets knocked out, so Congress has to choose between Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. And Henry Clay will help marshal the votes to get John Quincy Adams elected. Now, probably the reason Henry Clay did this was because John Quincy Adams' political program was most similar to his. However, when John Quincy Adams takes office, he appoints Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Now, there's two parts of this, right? On the one hand, Secretary of State is a very powerful position in the government. Second of all, for almost the past 20 years, every Secretary of State succeeded the president, right? Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State. Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. Adams was Monroe's Secretary of State. So the idea was by giving Clay this office, John Quincy Adams was helping cement Henry Clay as the next president of the United States. So for Jackson and his supporters, they began to complain that this was a corrupt bargain, that Clay basically traded the votes for access to office. And so this basically hampers Adams' presidency, being attacked as deeply corrupt. But you'll learn more about that in the documentary. All I wanted to do was kind of fill in a little bit about who John Quincy Adams is, his very short term from 1824 to 28, right, the first president since his father to only have one term as president and being defeated by a rival in the second term. And from that point on, we're going to see the unleashing of Jacksonian democracy and all of its goods and all of its bads. And so that's what you'll learn about next week. So until then, I'm John Parks. I'll see you guys. Stay in peace and hang in there. Bye.